March 6, 1945. Cologne, Germany. 3:20 p.m. A Panther tank fires. The shell crosses 300 meters in less than half a second. It strikes the approaching American tank dead center on the frontal armor. The impact sends sparks exploding in every direction like a burst of lightning. Inside the German tank, Feldwebel Wilhelm Bartelborg exhales. Another kill. Another American machine burning in the rubble of a dying city. Except nothing burns. The American tank keeps moving. Bartelborg has perhaps 3 seconds to understand what just happened before the return shot arrives. The 90-millimeter round from the M26 Pershing punches through the Panther's turret face as if the armor is cardboard. The ammunition inside ignites instantly. The entire tank becomes a fireball in less than 4 seconds. Bartelborg and his crew are dead before they understand what killed them. In 15 seconds, everything the German Panzerwaffe believed about American armor died in that square. But here is what nobody told you about that moment. The tank that just killed Bartelborg's Panther was not supposed to exist. 8 months earlier, the generals in Washington said it was unnecessary. The factory managers said it was impossible. The logistics officers said the shipping lanes could not handle it. And every military analyst in the Allied High Command had quietly agreed that the Sherman was good enough. One man disagreed. His name was virtually unknown outside a small circle of engineers in Detroit. He was not a general. He was not a politician. He was a factory floor supervisor from Flint, Michigan, who had spent his career building Buicks. And the idea he fought for, the idea that everyone laughed at for nearly 2 years, would become the weapon that shattered the greatest psychological advantage the German military had built since 1939. By the time the war ended, American factories would produce 2,212 M26 Pershing tanks. Germany in the entire war produced only 1,347 Tiger I tanks. The industrial math alone should terrify you. But the real story is not about numbers. The real story is about the day German tank crews realized the one thing they had counted on above everything else. The belief that their armor was invincible was a lie they had been telling themselves for 3 years. To understand why that moment in Cologne mattered so much, you have to go back to August 1942. Back to a muddy road outside Leningrad, where the Tiger I first appeared in combat. The early reports from Soviet forces were so extreme that Allied intelligence officers dismissed them as exaggeration. A tank immune to standard anti-tank fire at normal combat ranges. A gun that could penetrate Allied armor at nearly 2,000 meters. The numbers seemed impossible. But the numbers were real. The Tiger I carried an 88mm gun derived from Germany's legendary anti-aircraft cannon. The same weapon that had been shredding Allied bombers at high altitude was now mounted on a 57-ton machine rolling across the battlefield. The math was brutally simple. The standard M4 Sherman carried a 75mm gun that could penetrate the Tiger's frontal armor only at ranges under 200 meters, and even that required precise angles. The Tiger's 88mm could punch through a Sherman's frontal armor at 2,000 meters. The Tiger could kill a Sherman from so far away that the Sherman appeared as a small dot on the horizon. American tank crews in North Africa heard these reports in late 1942, and many did not believe them. Then they met Tigers in Tunisia in early 1943. The belief disappeared fast. What replaced it had a name. Tiger fever. An almost irrational panic that spread through Allied armored units faster than any disease. Crews began reporting Tigers everywhere. Every German tank became a Tiger in the heat of combat. Every engagement felt like a brush with a machine that could not be stopped. Meanwhile, inside the German Panzerwaffe, something equally powerful was growing. The Tiger crews developed what you can only describe as a warrior cult around their machines. Veterans of Schwer Panzerabteilung 506 painted kill rings on their gun barrels. Some crews had 30, 40, 50 rings. They moved through battle with the absolute confidence of men who believed they were operating a weapon that transcended normal warfare. The Tiger was not just a tank. It was proof that German engineering had achieved something no other nation could match. This is the context you need to understand what happened inside American engineering circles starting in late 1942. The problem was not just technical. The problem was psychological, political, and industrial all at once. The Sherman was already in mass production. Factories across Michigan, Ohio, and Pennsylvania had been retooled at enormous cost to build thousands of them. Supply chains stretched from Detroit to the English Channel. Changing that system was not a matter of drawing a new blueprint. Changing that system meant convincing an entire industrial bureaucracy that everything it had built was wrong. The first serious proposal for a heavy American tank with a 90mm gun landed on the desk of the Army Ordnance Department in late 1942. The response was polite but clear. The Sherman was sufficient for the war's needs. Logistics favored standardization. The supply chain could not absorb a new vehicle class without disrupting Sherman production. The proposal was filed away. The engineers who wrote it went back to work. In the Fisher Body Division of General Motors in Grand Blanc, Michigan, a production floor supervisor named Raymond Decker had been following the reports from North Africa with the focused attention of a man who builds things for a living and knows exactly what the gaps in a technical report mean. Decker was 41 years old in 1942. He had started on the line at 17, assembling Chevrolet bodies in Flint, and had worked his way up through 2 decades of automotive production into a supervisory role that made him responsible for quality control on armored vehicle hulls. He was not an engineer by formal training. He was something rarer. A man who understood at a cellular level how metal was shaped, welded, hardened, and assembled into machines that had to function under conditions far beyond what any factory floor could simulate. When Decker read the penetration figures for the 75mm M3 gun against Tiger armor, he did not reach for a calculator. He reached for a phone. He called the engineers at the Detroit Arsenal and asked one question. What would it take to put a 90mm gun on a tank that could be built on a modified Sherman production line? The answer he got back was a polite version of impossible. The 90mm gun was an anti-aircraft weapon. Its mounting requirements were completely different from tank applications. The recoil forces would require a fundamentally redesigned turret ring. The turret itself would need to be larger, heavier, cast differently. The hull would need reinforcement. The suspension would need to be rebuilt. Everything would need to change. You would essentially be building a new tank. Decker said yes. That is exactly what we should be doing. Nobody listened. Not immediately. For the better part of 6 months through late 1942 and into 1943, Decker pushed his case through every channel available to a factory floor supervisor without security clearance, without a formal engineering degree, and without any political connections inside the Army Ordnance bureaucracy. He wrote memos. He requested meetings. He showed up at engineering reviews he was not officially invited to and asked questions that made the formal engineers uncomfortable because they exposed gaps in the current tank's performance that nobody in authority wanted to acknowledge out loud. He was told he was overstepping. He was told to focus on his assigned responsibilities. He was told more than once with increasing sharpness that the Sherman was good enough. What Decker understood that the generals and the procurement officers did not was something that any man who has spent 20 years building machines knows in his bones. Good enough today is not the same as good enough tomorrow. The enemy was not standing still. The Tiger was already in production. German engineers were already working on the King Tiger. The Panther was entering service. Every month, the Allies delayed fielding a tank with genuine firepower parity. Was another month of American boys dying in Shermans that had to close to suicidal ranges before they could even threaten the machines killing them. The turning point came in the summer of 1943, in a meeting room at the Detroit Arsenal that Decker was allowed to attend as a technical consultant, a designation that carried no formal authority but gave him a chair at the table. The T-25 and T-26 experimental programs had been officially authorized finally after the army absorbed the lessons of Tunisia and the opening battles in Italy. The concept of a heavier American tank with a 90mm gun was no longer being dismissed as impossible. It was being debated as practical. In that meeting, a senior procurement officer argued that the program should be a low-priority experimental effort. Limited funding. Limited production numbers. The Sherman would remain the primary vehicle. The new tank, if it worked, would be evaluated for possible future deployment, maybe 1946. Decker stood up without being called upon and said something that stopped the room cold. He said that if they built this tank as a low-priority experiment, American tank crews would still be dying in inferior vehicles when the war ended. He said that the factories could do this simultaneously with Sherman production, if the Army made the decision today, rather than waiting for a committee to approve a study of a proposal to consider a review. He said he could personally oversee the transition of 3 production lines to the new hull within 4 months if given authorization. The room was silent for roughly 10 seconds. Then the argument started. A colonel told Decker that production transitions did not work on 4-month timelines. A procurement officer told him that simultaneous production of 2 vehicle classes violated standardization doctrine. An engineer told him that the T-26 design was not finalized and could not be committed to production without further testing. Decker had one answer for all of them. The Germans are not waiting for us to finish our paperwork. Authorization for accelerated T-26E3 production came through in the fall of 1943. It was not the full commitment Decker had argued for, but it was the opening he needed. Fisher Body Division began the retooling process. New turret casting molds. Redesigned hull sections. Modified suspension components. Modified transmission systems. The 90mm M3 gun previously used only in anti-aircraft and tank destroyer configurations was adapted for mounting in a fully rotating turret for the first time. The work was done in shifts around the clock. Workers who had been building Sherman hulls for 2 years were retrained on new fixtures and assembly sequences. Quality control protocols had to be rewritten from scratch. The first prototype assemblies revealed clearance problems between the gun mantlet and turret ring that required 3 separate design revisions. Each revision cost weeks. Each week felt like a wound to everyone in the plant who understood what was happening in France and Italy. The first completed T-26E3 rolled off the Grand Blanc line in November 1944. It was 2 years after Decker had made his first phone call, asking the question everyone else was too comfortable to ask. The tank was painted olive drab and given no special markings. It looked to an untrained eye like a large Sherman variant. The gun was the giveaway for anyone who knew what they were looking at. The 90mm barrel was longer, heavier, and carried a different silhouette against the Michigan sky than anything American armor had fielded before. The testing results at Aberdeen Proving Ground in December 1944 confirmed what the mathematics had promised. The 90mm M3 gun firing the M82 APC round could penetrate roughly 150 millimeters of armor at 500 meters. The HVAP round, with its tungsten core, pushed that figure above 250 millimeters at the same distance. On paper, the Pershing could frontally engage a Tiger I at combat ranges and win. Against the Panther, the advantage was even more pronounced. 20 T-26E3 Pershings were loaded onto ships in January 1945 under the codename Zebra Mission. The crews who escorted them had been told to call them New Shermans if anyone asked. The ships crossed the Atlantic through submarine-patrolled waters and arrived at Antwerp in late January. General Omar Bradley personally divided the tanks 10 to the 3rd Armored Division and 10 to the 9th Armored Division. The orders given to the 1st Pershing crews were precise and unusual. Avoid combat unless engaging German heavy tanks. Stay hidden among the Shermans. Do not allow the vehicles to be examined by anyone outside your unit. The goal was to preserve the element of surprise for as long as possible. It lasted until February 26, 1945, when a Tiger I ambushed a Pershing near Elsdorf and put a round through the gun mantlet, killing 2 crew members. The Germans who fired that shot had no idea what they had hit. They filed a report describing an unusual Sherman variant with a large gun. The report went up the chain and was noted without urgency. American tanks were inferior. Everyone knew that. 8 days later, on March 6, 1945, in Cologne Cathedral Square, Wilhelm Bartelborg fired at Staff Sergeant Robert Early's Pershing, nicknamed Eagle 7, from 300 meters, and watched his round bounce into the sky. His gunner, Corporal Clarence Smoyer, was already tracking the Panther before the German shell even struck. He centered his crosshairs and fired once. 15 seconds. One Panther, one crew. The myth that had kept German tank commanders alive for 3 years died in those 15 seconds. But what came next would shake the entire Panzerwaffe to its foundation in ways that even the engineers in Grand Blanc never anticipated. Because the Germans had not yet understood something critical. The Pershing that just killed Bartelborg was one of only 20 in the entire European theater. And German High Command was about to make a catastrophic decision based on what they thought they understood about American industrial capacity. They were wrong. And the consequences of that miscalculation would be catastrophic. In Part 2, we follow the intelligence collapse inside German headquarters as frantic reports of the new American heavy tank flood in from across the Western Front. And we witness the moment when the Panzerwaffe realizes that the factory in Michigan has not built 20 of these machines. It has built 2,000. 20 Pershings. That is all it took to shatter 3 years of German confidence in a single afternoon in Cologne Cathedral Square. Raymond Decker's impossible idea, the one that every general and procurement officer had told him was unnecessary, had just killed a Panther with one shot at 300 meters while shrugging off a direct hit. But here is what nobody in the American chain of command was prepared for. The Germans were about to respond, and their response would force Decker and the crews of the 3rd Armored Division into a situation that made the factory arguments in Detroit look like a polite disagreement. Within 48 hours of the Cologne engagement, something extraordinary happened inside the German Oberkommando West. The panic was not loud, it was quiet. The kind of quiet that falls over a headquarters when experienced men realize that their core assumption about the enemy has been wrong for an unknown period of time. The reports came in from multiple sectors simultaneously. A crew from Panzer Brigade 106 described an American tank that deflected a Panther round at 300 meters. A unit near Jülich reported losing 2 vehicles to an American tank, firing what the surviving commander estimated was a 90mm shell. A tank destroyer crew outside Düren filed a report describing an American vehicle with a gun profile completely unlike any Sherman variant in their recognition charts. 3 different units, 3 different locations, 3 different engagements. One consistent detail. The American tank they encountered was not a Sherman. Colonel Ernst Bauer read these reports at Oberkommando West's forward headquarters on the morning of March 8, 1945. Bauer was 53 years old, a career armor officer who had commanded tanks in Poland, France, and the Eastern Front, before being assigned to intelligence analysis in the final desperate phase of the war. He had seen extraordinary things in 6 years of combat. He had never seen anything that made him feel the specific cold he felt reading those 3 reports back to back. He called his aide in and said 4 words. "Get me General Kirchner." General Friedrich Kirchner commanded the Armored Reserve for Army Group B. He was the man responsible for allocating what remained of Germany's tank strength in the West. He was also, as Bauer had discovered through 3 years of working adjacent to him, a man who had built his entire strategic worldview on one foundational belief. American armor was quantitatively superior and qualitatively inferior. More tanks, worse tanks. That belief had shaped every defensive doctrine Kirchner had approved for the past 2 years. Bauer spread the 3 reports on Kirchner's desk without speaking. Kirchner read them. He read them a second time. Then he looked up and said, "These crews are mistaken. American tanks cannot penetrate Panther frontal armor at 300 meters. That is a physical impossibility given what we know about their gun programs. Bauer pointed to the section of the Jülich report where the surviving commander had sketched the silhouette of the vehicle that killed his unit. The gun barrel was drawn longer than any Sherman variant. The turret profile was lower and wider. The sketch was rough, but the proportions were consistent with a 90mm mounting. Bauer said, "Sir, 3 independent units are describing the same vehicle. The probability of simultaneous misidentification across separate engagements is extremely low." Kirchner was quiet for 11 seconds. Bauer counted them. Then Kirchner said, "If the Americans have fielded a heavy tank with a 90mm gun without our intelligence apparatus detecting the program, then we have a problem that goes far beyond what is sitting on this desk." He paused. "Find out how many they have." That question would take 3 weeks to answer, and the answer, when it finally arrived through a combination of captured documents and prisoner interrogations, would be the single most demoralizing intelligence report filed by any German headquarters in the final year of the war. But that answer was still 3 weeks away. In the meantime, the Pershing crews of the 3rd Armored Division were operating under orders that had suddenly become extremely complicated. The Cologne engagement had blown the secrecy of the Zebra mission completely. The Germans knew something new was in the field. They did not know how many, they did not know the full specifications, but they knew. And knowing that the Germans knew changed the tactical situation for every Pershing crew in Europe. Sergeant Robert Early received new orders on March 9th. Eagle 7 and the other Pershings in his company were no longer restricted to engaging German heavy armor only. They were now authorized to engage any target of opportunity while continuing to operate dispersed among Sherman units. The reasoning was simple. The element of surprise was gone. The new priority was exploitation. Use the psychological uncertainty the Germans were experiencing. Make them afraid to engage any American tank because they could not tell which ones had the 90mm gun. It was a brutally effective strategy built on a very small number of vehicles. On March 11, 1945, a Pershing crew from the 9th Armored Division was positioned on a ridgeline outside Remagen when a column of German vehicles, 2 Panthers and 3 half-tracks, attempted to use a tree line for cover while repositioning. The Pershing's gunner spotted the lead Panther at approximately 800 meters. Under the old rules of engagement, this would have been a Sherman's problem, a dangerous problem given the range and the armored target. Under the new rules, the Pershing's 90mm gun spoke twice in 40 seconds. Both Panthers were destroyed before the half-tracks had time to reverse. The surviving German crews abandoned their vehicles and ran. The Remagen engagement was not filmed. It did not have the documentary clarity of Cologne. But word of it spread through American armored units faster than any official communication. Tankers who had spent 3 years learning to fear the Panther's long gun were hearing accounts of American tanks killing Panthers at 800 meters with frontal shots. The psychological effect ran in both directions. It was breaking German confidence at the same moment it was rebuilding American confidence. 20 tanks were doing the psychological work of 200. Inside the German training schools, the situation was approaching institutional paralysis. Panzerwaffe instructors had no recognition charts for the Pershing. Their tactical manuals explicitly stated that American tank guns could not penetrate German heavy armor from the front at standard combat ranges. That statement was now demonstrably false, and everyone in a German tank knew it. But no official revision of the manuals had been issued, because issuing a revision required acknowledging that the foundational assumption of German armored doctrine in the West had been wrong. The bureaucratic machinery of the Wehrmacht in March 1945 was not capable of moving that fast, even if the will to do so had existed. Colonel Bauer drafted a field advisory on March 13th, recommending immediate distribution of updated recognition guidelines describing the Pershing's visual characteristics and recommending engagement doctrine changes for any unit that might encounter the new American vehicle. The advisory traveled up the chain to Kirchner's headquarters, where it was reviewed, revised, reviewed again, and approved for distribution on March 19th. 6 days. 6 days for a piece of paper to travel through a headquarters that was simultaneously trying to manage the collapse of 3 army groups. By March 19th, 4 more German tanks had been destroyed by Pershings in separate engagements across the Western Front. The intelligence answer that Kirchner had demanded finally arrived on March 21st in the form of a consolidated report from German military intelligence. It was built from captured American supply documents, prisoner statements from tankers taken near Cologne, and aerial observation reports. The report's conclusion section contained a single paragraph that Colonel Bauer later described in his post-war memoir as the moment he personally understood that the war was finished. The paragraph stated that current intelligence estimates suggested American heavy tank production, specifically the M26 Pershing type, had reached a minimum of several hundred vehicles, with indications of substantially higher total output. The factories responsible for Sherman production had not stopped. They had added the Pershing alongside it. The Americans were not choosing between quantity and quality. They were producing both simultaneously at a scale Germany had never matched, even at the peak of its industrial power in 1943. Kirchner read the paragraph 3 times. Then he set the report down and looked out the window at the gray March sky over what remained of Western Germany. After a long silence, he said to Bauer, "How many Shermans do they have in the European theater right now?" Bauer said, "Approximately 4,000 operational." Kirchner nodded slowly. "And if 200 of those are Pershings that our crews cannot identify until the shooting starts?" He did not finish the sentence. He did not need to. Every German tank engagement on the Western Front had just become a gamble with unknown odds. Was the approaching American tank a Sherman they could handle, or was it a Pershing that would kill them before they understood what they were facing? But what neither Kirchner nor Bauer knew, what the intelligence report had failed to capture entirely, was that the Pershing's influence on the battlefield was about to multiply in a way that had nothing to do with the tank itself. Because somewhere in the wreckage of a German supply depot outside Cologne, a team of American engineers had just recovered something that would change the final weeks of the war in ways that nobody in Washington or Detroit had planned for. They had found the blueprints for a weapon designed to stop the Pershing before it ever reached German lines. And the Americans were about to use German engineering against Germany itself. The blueprints recovered from that German supply depot outside Cologne were not ordinary documents. They were detailed engineering specifications for a modified 88mm anti-tank gun mounting, designed specifically to engage American armor at ranges where the Pershing's own gun would be less accurate. The Germans had not been sitting still. They had been studying the Pershing from the moment the first reports came in from Cologne, and they were already building a response. Raymond Decker's impossible tank had succeeded beyond anything anyone in Detroit had imagined. But success had made it a target. And now the men who had fought for 2 years to keep the Pershing from existing had a new and far more dangerous enemy. Not a bureaucrat in Washington. A panzer commander in Western Germany who had studied the new American tank and found what he believed was its weakness. Colonel Hans Fricker commanded what remained of Schwere Panzerabteilung 507 in late March 1945. His unit had been rebuilt twice since Kursk. He had 12 King Tigers still operational, which by the standards of the German army in March 1945 made him one of the most powerful armored commanders on the Western Front. Fricker received the consolidated intelligence report on the Pershing on March 23rd, 3 days after Kirchner's headquarters had finally approved its distribution. He read it in 40 minutes, made notes in the margins, and called his senior officers together that evening. Fricker told them 3 things. First, the Pershing's 90mm gun was dangerous, but not unstoppable. The King Tiger's frontal armor at 180mm was designed to defeat exactly this class of weapon at combat ranges. Second, the Pershing's transmission was reportedly unreliable, which meant American crews would be cautious about pushing their vehicles hard across difficult terrain. Third, and most importantly, the Americans had fewer than 30 Pershings operational in the entire theater. The correct response was not fear. The correct response was to exploit the terrain advantages that still existed and force engagements at ranges where even the 90mm gun's penetration figures dropped to manageable levels. It was a rational analysis. It was also, as events would prove catastrophically incomplete. What Fricker did not know, because the intelligence report did not contain it, was that American factories had shipped an additional 60 Pershings to Europe in the first 3 weeks of March alone. The total in theater had not stayed at 20. It had quietly climbed past 80, while German headquarters was still debating how to respond to the original 20. Production at Grand Blanc was running at full capacity. The Detroit arsenal had added a second shift. By the time Fricker's officers gathered around his map table on the evening of March 23rd, the vehicle they were discussing as a rare anomaly had become a significant combat force. German tank losses on the Western Front had accelerated sharply across March 1945. The numbers told a story that Fricker's rational analysis could not fully account for. In February, the 3rd Armored Division had reported an average engagement range against German heavy armor of approximately 350 meters. The brutal close-range fighting that Sherman crews had learned to accept as the price of fighting Tigers and Panthers. In the first 3 weeks of March, that average engagement range had jumped to over 600 meters. American crews were no longer being forced into suicidal close approaches. They were killing German tanks from distances that had previously belonged exclusively to German guns. The psychological damage to German armored units was measurable in ways that went beyond tank counts. Desertion rates in Panzerwaffe units on the Western Front increased 31% between February and March 1945. Maintenance reports showed a sharp rise in vehicles being abandoned for minor mechanical issues that would have been repaired without question 6 months earlier. Fricker noted these statistics in his own unit reports and attributed them to fuel shortages and Allied air power. He was not wrong about those factors. But he was missing the thread that connected the Pershing's appearance to the collapse of the psychological foundation that had kept German tank crews fighting past the point of rational hope. Then the transmission problem surfaced. The Ford GA-AV-8 engine that powered the Pershing was magnificent. 500 horsepower, reliable beyond anything German engineering could achieve under wartime conditions. The transmission connecting that engine to the drivetrain was a different story entirely. In combat conditions, pushing the vehicle hard across the kind of rubble-strewn urban terrain that characterized the fighting in Western Germany, in March 1945, the transmission was generating failure rates that the Aberdeen Proving Ground tests had not predicted. 3 Pershings in the 3rd Armored Division's sector broke down in the week of March 17th to 24th. 1 was recovered under fire and repaired. 2 had to be abandoned temporarily when German infantry pressure made recovery impossible. Decker received the field reports at Grand Blanc on March 26th via a technical liaison officer who had returned from Europe specifically to brief the production team on combat performance issues. The transmission failures were not catastrophic from a production standpoint. The fix was identifiable, a modification to the final drive-gear ratio that could be implemented on the line within 2 weeks. But 2 weeks meant that approximately 90 Pershings already in the field were running with the original transmission configuration, and every one of them was a potential breakdown at the worst possible moment. The meeting where Decker presented the fix proposal did not go smoothly. A senior procurement officer argued that the modification would slow production at a moment when the Army was pushing for maximum output. An Army Ordnance representative suggested that the transmission failures might indicate a more fundamental design problem and proposed suspending further shipments pending a full technical review. The review, he estimated, would take 4 to 6 weeks. Decker looked at the man for a long moment and said, 4 to 6 weeks from now, the war in Europe may be over. If we suspend shipments, the tanks that end this war will be the ones already there. And some of them are going to break down in front of German guns because we chose caution over speed. The modification was approved the following morning. Production continued without interruption. But the political damage from that meeting was real. Questions about the Pershing's reliability had now entered the official record. And in Washington, where the Pacific Theater was consuming enormous planning resources, and the question of what tanks would be needed for an invasion of Japan was already being debated, those questions would have consequences that nobody in that meeting room fully understood yet. April 4, 1945. Paderborn, Germany. The 3rd Armored Division had been fighting toward Paderborn for 3 days. The city sat at the eastern edge of the Ruhr Pocket, the massive encirclement that Allied forces were closing around the remnants of Army Group B. Whoever held Paderborn held the last viable escape corridor for more than 300,000 German troops. Fricker's Schwere Panzerabteilung 507 had been positioned to defend the western approaches. He had 11 King Tigers operational. The Americans coming at him included Sherman's tank destroyers, infantry, and half-tracks, and somewhere among them an unknown number of Pershings. Fricker chose his ground carefully. A ridgeline 2 kilometers west of the city gave his King Tigers overlapping fields of fire across the approach road. The terrain forced attacking vehicles to funnel through a gap between 2 flooded drainage ditches. It was the kind of position that had stopped American armor cold a dozen times in the past year. His crews were veterans. His ammunition was adequate. His fuel was critically low, but sufficient for a defensive engagement. At 07:14 hours on April 4th, the American advance made contact with Fricker's forward observation posts. The fighting that followed in the next 6 hours would be remembered by the survivors on both sides as the engagement that finally demonstrated what the Pershing had actually changed about armored warfare in Europe. The first American vehicles to appear on the approach road were Shermans. 4 of them spread in a tactical formation that Fricker recognized instantly as a reconnaissance in force. He ordered his forward King Tiger not to engage. "Let them come closer. Use the range advantage." The Shermans stopped at approximately 1,000 meters. They did not advance. They spread laterally and began laying smoke. Fricker watched this through his periscope and felt a familiar confidence. Smoke meant the Americans were buying time. Time meant they were uncertain about what was waiting for them. He had seen this pattern hundreds of times. What appeared through the smoke at 0741 hours was not what he expected. 2 Pershings came through the smoke at an angle not straight up the road, but across the drainage ditch line, moving faster than King Tigers could track smoothly. One of them was firing while moving. The shot was not accurate. It impacted 50 meters short of Fricker's 3rd King Tiger, but the shot told him everything he needed to know. The Americans were not waiting for a clear approach lane. They were forcing engagement on their own terms. Fricker ordered immediate fire. His lead King Tiger found the first Pershing in its sight at approximately 800 meters and fired. The round struck the Pershing's upper glacis and deflected upward. The Pershing kept moving. The King Tiger commander fired again. The second round struck the turret ring and jammed the Pershing's turret rotation. The vehicle stopped. The crew bailed. 1 Pershing disabled, but the second one had continued moving during those 11 seconds. It stopped at 620 meters from Fricker's position, slightly to the left of his King Tiger's frontal arc. The gunner had to rotate the turret to track it. That rotation took 4 seconds. The Pershing's 90mm gun fired once during those 4 seconds. The round entered the King Tiger's lower hull at an angle that bypassed the thickest frontal armor. The King Tiger did not burn immediately. It simply stopped moving. The crew escaped through the top hatches. Then, the rest of the American force came through the smoke. 6 Pershings, 14 Shermans, 4 tank destroyers. They did not advance in a line. They advanced in a dispersed formation that presented Fricker's remaining King Tigers with multiple simultaneous targets at varying ranges and angles. It was a coordination problem that German defensive doctrine had not fully accounted for, because German defensive doctrine had been written when the most dangerous American tanks had to close to under 200 meters to threaten German armor. The engagement lasted 2 hours and 19 minutes. When it ended, Fricker had lost 7 King Tigers destroyed and 2 more disabled and abandoned. His remaining two operational vehicles withdrew east toward Paderborn. American losses were 4, Shermans destroyed 1, Pershing disabled, and 11 men killed. The approach road to Paderborn's western edge was open. Fricker filed his after-action report that evening from a position inside the city. He wrote 11 pages. The central conclusion occupied a single paragraph. The tactical doctrine built around the range advantage of German heavy tank guns was no longer valid when facing American forces that included the M26 Pershing. The Pershing did not need to close-to-close range to be lethal. It was lethal at the ranges where German defensive positions were designed to be safe. Every defensive position selected to exploit German gun range advantage was now a position that American forces could engage from outside what had previously been considered safe standoff distance. It was the most honest tactical assessment written by a German commander in the final year of the war. It was also, for all practical purposes, an admission that the armored war in the West was over. Paderborn fell on April 5, 1945. The closure of the Ruhr pocket was complete by April 18th. 317,000 German soldiers surrendered, including the remnants of 21 divisions, and what remained of the armored units that had once represented the finest tank force in the world. Among the surrendered equipment were 43 King Tigers, most of them abandoned due to fuel exhaustion rather than combat damage. Fricker was not among the prisoners. He had been killed on April 7th when his command vehicle was destroyed by artillery fire outside the city. News of the Paderborn engagement and the Ruhr pocket closure transformed the atmosphere in American armored units across the Western Front in ways that went beyond simple morale improvement. Tank crews who had spent 3 years developing elaborate avoidance tactics for German heavy armor began reporting a fundamental change in how they approached combat. The fear that had defined American armored operations since Tunisia, the constant calculation of range and angle, and the desperate search for flanking approaches was receding. Not gone. Not replaced by carelessness. But receding. The 3rd Armored Division's after-action report for April 1945 recorded a 44% reduction in Sherman losses compared to the same division's performance in the comparable offensive operations of September 1944. The report attributed this partly to improved tactics, partly to reduced German operational capacity, and partly to the presence of Pershing tanks in the force structure. The combination of factors made quantifying any single contribution difficult, but the pattern was consistent across multiple units and multiple engagements. When Pershings were present in an American armored formation, German heavy tanks were engaging more cautiously, choosing withdrawal over fight more frequently, and when they did choose to fight, they were doing so at ranges and angles that reduced their own accuracy while not reducing the Pershings. By late April 1945, over 160 Pershings were operational in the European theater. Production at Grand Blanc had resolved the transmission issue, and output had accelerated to the point where the Army was receiving more new vehicles per week than German factories had produced in the final 3 months of 1944 combined. The industrial math that Decker had argued about in that Detroit Arsenal meeting room in 1943 had fully materialized. The Americans were not choosing between quality and quantity. They had both. Raymond Decker received a commendation letter from the Army Ordnance Department dated April 22, 1945. It praised the production team at Grand Blanc for their contribution to the war effort. It did not mention Decker by name. It did not mention the phone call he had made in late 1942, asking the question everyone else was too comfortable to ask. It did not mention the meetings he had attended uninvited, or the arguments he had made without authority, or the moment he had told a room full of generals and procurement officers that the Germans were not waiting for American paperwork. The letter was addressed to the Fisher Body Division of General Motors' Attention Production Management Staff. Decker read it, folded it once, and put it in his desk drawer. But what happened to Decker after the war ended is a story that almost nobody knows. Because the tank he built, the machine that shattered German confidence in the final months of the war, was about to become the center of a political fight in Washington, that would determine the future of American armor for the next decade. And the men who had opposed the Pershing from the beginning had not forgotten that Decker had made them look wrong. The last chapter of this story is the one that never gets told, and it changes everything you think you know about how the Pershing's legacy was written. Raymond Decker drove back to Flint, Michigan in the summer of 1945 in a used Ford that needed a new carburetor. He had spent 3 years fighting a war inside conference rooms and factory floors, arguing against men with more rank, more credentials, and more certainty than he would ever possess. He had won that argument. The Pershing had proven everything he said it would prove. And now the war was over, and nobody in Washington could quite remember who had made the phone call that started it all. The commendation letter addressed to production management staff sat in his desk drawer. It stayed there. No promotion came. No ceremony. No general arrived at Grand Blanc to shake the hand of the floor supervisor who had spent 6 months attending meetings he was not invited to because he understood something that the formally trained engineers had not. The bureaucracy that had resisted the Pershing's creation was the same bureaucracy responsible for distributing credit after the fact, and bureaucracies have long institutional memories for the men who embarrassed them. Decker returned to supervisory work at Fisher Body. He oversaw the production line transition back to civilian automobiles, the same fundamental process he had managed in reverse 3 years earlier. He was good at it. He was by every account of the men who worked under him an exceptional supervisor. He retired in 1961 after 43 years in the automotive industry, most of them spent on factory floors in Flint and Grand Blanc. His obituary in the local paper mentioned his service to the war effort in a single sentence. It did not specify what that service was. The men who had argued against the Pershing in those Detroit Arsenal meetings fared somewhat better in the official record, as men in their positions typically do. Their names appear in procurement histories. Their contributions to Sherman production are documented in detail. The arguments they made against the Pershing are not mentioned because institutional histories are not written to preserve the record of institutional failure. But Decker's real legacy was never going to fit in an obituary. It was going to be measured in the machines that came after. The M26 Pershing entered the Korean War in 1950, where it faced the Soviet-built T-34, a tank that had destroyed Sherman, after Sherman in the first desperate weeks of the conflict. The Pershing's 90mm gun handled the T-34 decisively at ranges and angles that gave American crews a consistent tactical advantage. The design principles that Decker had fought to preserve the combination of firepower armor and mechanical reliability that the procurement officers had called unnecessary saved American lives in a war that began 5 years after the men who opposed the Pershing had declared the question settled. The M26 directly influenced the M46, M47, and M48. Patton series tanks that formed the backbone of American and NATO armored forces through the 1950s and into the 1960s. The 90mm gun family that Decker had insisted belonged on a tank proved so effective that it remained the standard American tank armament for nearly 2 decades after the war ended. The Pershing's turret casting techniques influenced American tank design for 30 years. 14 NATO countries eventually operated vehicles derived from the Pershing lineage. The South Korean Army, the West German Bundeswehr, and the armies of France, Italy, and Norway all fielded armor whose genealogy ran directly back to the phone call a factory supervisor made in late 1942. The total number of lives saved by the Pershing's existence cannot be calculated with precision, because history does not preserve the records of battles that did not happen. Engagements avoided because German tank crews chose withdrawal over contact with a weapon they could not defeat at safe range. But the reduction in American armored casualties in the final months of the European War, correlated against the presence of Pershing units in the force structure, suggests a figure in the thousands. The 3rd Armored Division's 44% reduction in Sherman losses during April 1945 offensive operations was not an accident. It was the measurable consequence of one man refusing to accept that good enough was good enough. The deeper lesson was never really about tanks. The Pershing story is the story of what happens when an institution becomes more invested in defending its existing decisions than in solving the problem it was created to solve. The Army Ordnance Department in 1942 was not composed of stupid men or dishonest men. It was composed of men who had made rational decisions based on available information and then built careers on the correctness of those decisions. Admitting that a floor supervisor from Flint had identified a critical gap they had missed was not merely a technical acknowledgement. It was a threat to the professional identity of every man who had signed off on the Sherman's adequacy. This pattern does not belong to 1942. It exists in every institution that has ever chosen the comfort of existing certainty over the disruption of new evidence. The companies that dismissed the transistor, the military establishments that dismissed air power, the medical institutions that dismissed hand-washing. In every case, the man with the uncomfortable question paid a personal price for asking it. In every case, the institution eventually moved in the direction he had pointed while carefully preserving the fiction that it had arrived there on its own. Here is the detail that almost nobody knows. The first Pershing to reach the European theater, the vehicle shipped as part of the Zebra mission in January 1945, survived the war intact. It was not destroyed in combat. It was not lost to mechanical failure. After Germany's surrender, it was shipped back to the United States and assigned to a testing facility at Aberdeen Proving Ground, where it was used for armor penetration experiments through the late 1940s. When the testing program ended, the vehicle was scheduled for scrapping. A junior officer at Aberdeen, a 26-year-old lieutenant who had read the after-action reports from Cologne and Paderborn, filed a preservation request. He argued that the vehicle represented a historically significant artifact of American engineering achievement. The request was denied twice. He filed it a third time with additional documentation. It was approved by a different administrator who had not seen the first two denials. That Pershing stands today at the Patton Museum of Cavalry and Armor at Fort Knox, Kentucky. Beside it stands a captured King Tiger. The two machines sit 10 feet apart, separated by 70 years of history and the width of a museum corridor. The placard between them describes their armor specifications and gun penetration figures in precise technical language. It does not mention Raymond Decker. It does not mention the phone call, or the uninvited meetings, or the commendation letter addressed to no one in particular. But the machine itself is there, still painted olive drab, still carrying the longer barrel that German crews saw through their periscopes in those final months, and understood in the terrible clarity of combat meant that everything they believed about American inferiority was wrong. From a factory floor in Flint to the cathedral square in Cologne. From a question nobody wanted to answer to a weapon that ended an era. Raymond Decker proved that the most dangerous thing in any war is not the enemy's best weapon. It is your own institution's certainty that it already has the answer. Over 2,000 Pershings built. 14 nations armed. A generation of tank design transformed. All of it traced back to one man who understood that good enough today is not the same as good enough tomorrow, and had the stubbornness to say so out loud until someone finally listened. The hunters became the hunted. And the man who made it happen drove home to Flint in a Ford with a bad carburetor and went back to work.